Tonight, we step back into a forgotten year of history, 1816, when summer never truly arrived. It was 1816, a year unlike any other, remembered by many as the year without a summer. Across villages, towns, and farms, the sun seemed weak, the warmth absent, and the air carried a strange, unyielding chill. Crops failed, rivers swelled, and hunger stretched its hand over entire nations, yet even in hardship, stories of resilience and creativity quietly emerged. Before we begin, I invite you to settle in. If you enjoy stories like this, slow, atmospheric, and designed to carry you gently toward rest, please remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I know many of you listen from across the United States, from Europe's old cities, and from many other places around the world. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you as you drift into this tale? Take a moment to make yourself comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body sink into a place of ease, and allow your breath to slow. But before we begin, take a moment to settle in and relax. And now, let us begin. The year opened like many others with hopes of spring's renewal. But soon, those who looked upward noticed something unsettling. The sky, instead of its usual brightness, carried a muted hue as if brushed with ash. Sunlight seemed weaker, filtered through a pale veil that dimmed fields and forests alike. Birds sang less vigorously, and the air itself felt damp and cool, carrying a chill that clung to skin even on days that should have been warm. In villages across Europe, farmers stepped into their fields with puzzled expressions. Seeds planted with care were slow to stir, reluctant to push through the soil. The earth held its secrets tightly, as though it too was unsure of the season. By June, when warmth should have ripened the meadows, frost kissed the edges of young shoots, curling tender leaves into lifeless shapes. In New England, across the ocean, families huddled in their homes as snow fell in June, a sight so strange it left people standing in silence at their doorways, watching flakes drift onto pastures meant for haymaking. Children who once anticipated summer games found themselves shivering in coats, their laughter muffled by the cold breath of a season gone astray. Everywhere people began to whisper questions. Had the sun weakened? Was this a sign perhaps of something beyond nature's cycle? Clergy gave sermons with somber tones, while older folk muttered about omens and divine warnings. The world seemed suspended in uncertainty, caught between expectation and unease. The summer sky, once a promise of warmth, had become a riddle no one could solve. As days stretched into weeks, people began to realize that something was deeply wrong. As the strange chill lingered, it was not long before the whispers of worry turned to murmurs of hunger. Markets, once filled with the bright colors of early produce, displayed only meager offerings. The few vegetables that reached the stalls looked small, stunted, and withered by frost. Grain, the lifeblood of bread and porridge, grew scarce as harvests faltered. In the countryside, farmers walked their fields with heavy hearts. Stalks of wheat, normally tall and golden by midsummer, struggled to reach knee-height. Barley fields looked patchy, their thin shoots bending under cold winds. Even hardy crops such as potatoes withered under repeated freezes, their blossoms blackened as though scorched by an invisible fire. Families began to tighten their belts. Meals became simpler, portions smaller. Where once there had been stews rich with vegetables, now there was only thin broth stretched with whatever could be spared. Children asked their mothers for more, but their mothers could only smile gently and shake their heads, hiding their own gnawing hunger. In towns and villages, people began to trade what they had. A loaf of bread might be exchanged for a sack of coal. A handful of beans might buy only a small wedge of cheese, and people feared that tomorrow there might be even less. And still, the skies gave no mercy. Gray clouds hung heavy, and when rain did fall, it was cold and unkind. flooding fields instead of nourishing them. Farmers' hands, calloused from work, trembled as they pulled up plants that had failed to root. It was as though nature itself had turned its face away, leaving humanity to fend for itself in the shadow of a forgotten summer. Yet amidst the unease, there was resilience. Neighbors shared what little they could spare. Fires glowed in hearths, and though meals were scant, families gathered close, drawing comfort from the warmth of each other's company. Hardship had come, but so too had a spirit of endurance. The calendar insisted it was summer, yet the air told another story. In June, instead of the golden shimmer of heat, mornings began with a frost that clung stubbornly to windows and grass. Fields sparkled as though it were December, each blade of grass wrapped in a crystal coat that crackled underfoot. Farmers rose at dawn, their breath puffing white into the stillness, and found their animals restless, uneasy, as if they too sensed that something was deeply wrong with the season. By midday the cold would lift only slightly. Instead of warmth, there was a damp, bone-deep chill that settled into the skin. The smell of wet earth lingered everywhere, rich but unproductive, as though the ground itself was reluctant to give up its harvest. Villagers spoke of the odd stillness in the air. Birds migrated earlier, their calls fainter. The hum of bees which should have filled the meadows was missing, and orchards bore blossoms that never ripened into fruit. Travelers told strange tales as they passed through towns. In the highlands of Scotland, snow had fallen even in July, blanketing hillsides meant to be alive with green. In Ireland, heavy rains drowned fields, leaving pools of stagnant water that festered with the scent of rot. Across New England, in America, snow fell in June and again in August, settling into the folds of hillsides, startling communities who had never before lit their hearths so deep into summer. Families there spoke of waking to a world glazed in white, of children staring wide-eyed as if the seasons themselves had become confused. The ocean winds carried a sharper bite, chilling sailors on decks where normally the sun would have warmed their shoulders. Fishing boats stayed closer to shore, wary of storms that rose suddenly, darkening skies without warning. Even the taste of the sea was different. Oysters and fish grew scarcer, as though the ocean itself was withholding its gifts. In towns, life adjusted with slow, uneasy compromise. Cloaks and shawls, folded away in spring, were drawn back out of trunks. Fires burned not only in the evenings, but throughout the day, the smoke rising in steady ribbons above rooftops. The scent of wood smoke lingered on clothes, a constant reminder that warmth now had to be fought for. Yet the chill was not only in the air, it seeped into hearts and minds. The uncertainty weighed heavily. People spoke in hushed tones in taverns and churches. Was it punishment, some asked, a warning from the heavens? Others blamed shifting winds, unseen forces, or even darker superstitions. No one understood the cause, but many sensed that something in the world had changed. Even in the strangeness, moments of beauty could be found. Morning mists hung thick in valleys, turning fields into silver seas. The faint light of the sun, weakened though it was, bathed the land in soft, dreamlike hues, making even barren meadows look ethereal. It was a haunting beauty, fragile and fleeting, like the calm before a storm no one could predict. The year was not simply cold. It was unsettled, unmoored, as if the earth itself had lost its rhythm. And for those living through it, every day carried the same unspoken question. How much worse would it become? By the time late summer should have painted fields in gold, the earth offered little but disappointment. Stalks of wheat, instead of rising proudly, stood thin and fragile, their heads barely formed. Farmers stooped low, running rough hands over the brittle plants, as though coaxing them might draw more life from the soil. But the truth was plain. Nature had betrayed them. The sounds of harvest, once lively with laughter and the rustle of grain, were eerily muted. Scythes swung through fields that should have been heavy with abundance, yet the baskets filled only with a meager trickle. The air carried not the scent of ripened crops, but the sharp bitterness of frost-burned stems. Even the ground felt different beneath their boots, harder, less forgiving, holding onto the cold, as if reluctant to release it. Villagers gathered in barns, laying out their pitiful harvests upon wooden tables. There were few smiles, only silence, broken occasionally by the sigh of a mother counting what little might feed her family. Some turned to bartering with neighbors, sacks of grain for firewood, bundles of wool for salted fish. Each exchange was careful, as families tried to stretch their food for the uncertain months ahead. In towns, bakers rationed flour, selling loaves cut thinner, stretching them with whatever substitutes could be found. Bread, once the simplest of comforts, became precious. People lined the streets at dawn, clutching coins tightly, hoping to buy even the smallest loaf before supplies vanished. The smell of baking bread, normally a symbol of warmth, now carried with it the ache of longing, for it reminded many of what they could no longer afford. The skies themselves seemed to conspire against recovery. Rains fell too heavily, flooding fields one week, only to be replaced by sudden frost the next. Streams overflowed, spreading the sour scent of damp hay and spoiled grain. Fruit trees bore little, their branches bare where apples and pears should have hung in abundance. Yet even during the crisis, small moments of kindness appeared. Families gathered around long tables with whatever they could muster, thin soup flavored with herbs, a heel of bread divided into careful portions, the faint sweetness of berries salvaged from hedgerows. They spoke softly, telling stories to distract the young from empty stomachs, reminding each other that seasons, however strange, could not last forever. Still, the shadow of hunger was growing, stretching long and ominous. What little had been gathered would not sustain everyone through the winter to come, and in the stillness of those cold evenings, as the light faded early and the fires burned low, the same question lingered in every heart. How would they endure the months ahead? As summer slipped away, the true weight of scarcity began to reveal itself not only in the fields, but in the markets. In cities and towns, the price of bread, so ordinary in other years, rose steeply, climbing with each passing week. A single loaf, once affordable even for the poorest laborer, became an item of careful calculation. Families stood in line at dawn, coins clutched tightly in chilled hands, only to discover that what had been enough yesterday was now insufficient today. The market stalls, usually vibrant with the colors of fresh produce, seemed almost bare. Baskets of grain were few and small, their contents guarded by watchful sellers who knew that hunger sharpened tempers. The voices of bargaining, once a lively chorus, grew tense, clipped, and edged with desperation. Where once neighbors exchanged pleasantries, now they eyed one another with suspicion, each fearful of being left without enough to carry home. Bread itself changed. Bakers, struggling to stretch their dwindling flour, began mixing it with other substances, ground peas, mashed beans, even sawdust in some desperate places. Loaves grew darker, heavier, and far less nourishing. The smell of baking still drifted through the streets, but it no longer promised the same comfort. Instead, it was a cruel reminder of what hunger had transformed. Children felt the hardship most keenly. Small hands reached eagerly for crumbs, their faces thin, their eyes wide with longing. Mothers tore bread into smaller and smaller pieces, trying to convince their children that the portions were enough. Even a shared meal became precious as families tried to make their food last. Yet even in this grim reality, acts of kindness flickered like candlelight. Neighbors shared crusts with one another, elders skipped meals to give more to the young, and communities organized simple gatherings where what little was available could be pooled. Around hearths, the faint scent of broth filled homes, stretching thin ingredients into something warm enough to soothe the spirit, if not the stomach. But as word spread of rising prices, unrest began to stir. In certain towns, groups gathered near bakeries, their voices raised not in anger at first, but in pleading. They begged for fairer prices, for some measure of compassion. Yet the bakers themselves were caught in the same trap, unable to sell at lower cost without risking ruin. Tension slowly grew in towns and markets as food supplies shrank. The year without a summer was not only about the absence of warmth, it was about the absence of plenty, the absence of security. And with every passing day, the simple loaf of bread became more than food. It became a symbol of survival itself. As the evenings grew longer, people discovered that the cold was only part of the hardship. The silence of the nights brought its own weight. In villages where summer evenings once rang with laughter, music, and the hum of insects, there was now only stillness, broken by the creak of timber in the wind or the distant howl of a restless dog. Inside cottages, fires burned low, carefully tended so as not to waste precious wood. Families huddled close, the flickering light painting soft shadows against rough walls. The smell of smoke lingered in their clothes and hair, mingling with the faint aroma of thin stews or roasted roots. The warmth of the hearth was fragile, its glow fading quickly if left untended. Every ember mattered, every log placed upon the fire, a choice weighed against the long months still to come. Sleep did not come easily. Hunger sharpened the edges of dreams, turning rest into a shallow drift rather than deep slumber. Stomachs growled in the darkness, echoing faintly in rooms where voices dared not speak of it aloud. Parents lay awake at night, trying to comfort children as hunger slowly spread. Beyond the walls, the land carried an eerie air. Frost formed delicate lace upon windows, and in the pale moonlight the fields gleamed as though draped in silver. It was beautiful, hauntingly so, yet carried a sense of wrongness, for these were sights meant for winter, not summer. Farmers sometimes stood at their thresholds late into the night, gazing out in disbelief, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that nothing about the seasons could be trusted any more. And yet, even in the unease, small comforts survived. A woolen blanket, mended and passed through generations, wrapped tightly around shoulders. The low hum of a lullaby sung softly by a mother filled the stillness with a thread of tenderness. In taverns where candles flickered and ale was watered thin, neighbors gathered, sharing not food, but companionship. Stories were told, some frightening, some humorous, all reminders that they were not facing this strangeness alone. But as the silence of night deepened, a thought whispered at the edges of every mind. If the summer was so cold, what would winter bring? The question lingered unspoken, pressing down heavier than the darkness itself. The strange year was not only marked by cold, it was unsettled, restless, as if the very skies had turned against the earth. Storms arrived without warning, carried on winds that howled across valleys and battered towns with merciless force. One evening, a pale light flickered on the horizon, and before villagers could finish securing shutters, the heavens split open. Sheets of rain lashed the ground, cold and unyielding, driven sideways by winds that snapped branches and tore thatch from rooftops. The air was filled with the scent of wet wood, churned mud, and smoke as fires sputtered in damp hearths. Lightning crackled across the dark sky, its brilliance lighting up entire landscapes for a heartbeat before plunging them back into shadow. In the countryside, fields already weakened by frost now lay drowned beneath the storm. Water pooled in furrows, carrying away the few surviving stalks of wheat and barley. Farmers waded through mud up to their knees, watching helplessly as their season's labor vanished beneath rising waters. The sound of rushing streams filled the night, louder than ever before, carrying with it broken branches and the debris of ruined harvests. In coastal towns, the sea seemed to rise with anger. Waves pounded harbors, spraying salt into the air, leaving boats tossed and splintered. Fishermen who had braved storms in the past found themselves retreating, their nets empty, their livelihoods threatened by waters that no longer obeyed familiar rhythms. The morning after such storms was always the same, quiet, heavy, and filled with the smell of sodden earth. Roads were washed out, cottages stood with broken roofs, and livestock wandered, dazed and drenched. The sight of flattened fields and fallen fences pressed despair into weary hearts, as if the land itself had grown tired of yielding to human hands. Yet amid destruction, small acts of endurance continued. Neighbors gathered to lift beams from collapsed barns, to patch roofs with whatever scraps remained. Children, still shivering from the night's terror, were coaxed into laughter as they splashed in puddles too large to step around. And though the storm seemed endless, there was always the fragile hope that tomorrow's dawn might bring calmer skies. But deep within, people sensed that the world had slipped its balance. Cold, frost, rain, and thunder. It was as if every season had collided at once, leaving none to rule clearly. And the question that weighed on every soul was no longer why this had happened, but how long it could possibly last. By the close of what should have been summer's peak, the barns stood oddly hollow. In ordinary years, they would be overflowing, lofts stuffed with hay, bins heavy with grain, and shelves stacked with jars of preserved fruit. The scent of dried grasses, ripe apples, and stored corn usually hung in the air, a promise of security through the coming winter. But now, when doors creaked open, they revealed emptiness, the echoes of footsteps louder than they had ever been. Farmers walked slowly through those spaces, lanterns casting thin beams of light over half-filled bins and scattered bundles. The smell was not of plenty, but of damp hay, faint mold, and disappointment. The livestock, too, felt the absence. Cows lowed hungrily, horses nosed through meager piles of feed, and chickens pecked at the dusty corners of coops. What should have been abundance was instead a fragile rationing, each handful measured with care, knowing it might be months before the earth was generous again. In kitchens, women set aside jars that would normally be opened for feasts and celebrations. Apples were shriveled instead of plump. Berries had been sparse, and root vegetables lay small and twisted, misshapen by cold. When families gathered for supper, the clatter of spoons against bowls seemed louder than the meal itself, for the bowls were filled with broth thinned beyond recognition. The taste of smoke from the hearth often overpowered the faint flavors of what little food remained. Markets reflected the same story. Traders had less to offer, their carts arriving light, their eyes watchful. The air that once buzzed with the lively chatter of barter now felt subdued, every exchange carrying tension. Prices soared, and tempers simmered just beneath the surface. The market square, once the beating heart of towns, became a place where silence pressed down like a heavy fog, broken only by muttered complaints and weary sighs. And yet, despite empty barns and larders, there was resilience. Families found clever ways to stretch what they had, stale bread softened in warm milk, wild herbs gathered from hedgerows, fish pulled from streams where the cold waters still yielded some life. People began sharing recipes of necessity, teaching one another how to create filling meals from the smallest of stores. These exchanges carried quiet hope, small reminders that even in scarcity, community could create a sense of warmth. Still, as the last days of summer faded into early autumn, the weight of the year was undeniable. The barns that should have been heavy with promise now whispered with emptiness, and the people, while enduring, braced themselves for the season they feared most, the winter that lay ahead. As autumn crept in, the unease that had lingered through summer began to deepen into something heavier. Fear was no longer just an undercurrent. It became part of every conversation, woven into the fabric of daily life. In taverns, where the crackle of fires offered brief comfort, men hunched close together, their voices low. Some spoke of omens, insisting the pale sun was a sign of divine displeasure. Others whispered of faraway volcanoes, of mountains that had spat fire into the sky, their smoke drifting unseen across the world to dim the light. Most had no proof, only rumors carried by travelers. But the stories lingered, feeding imaginations already fertile with worry. In churches, pews filled with people searching for answers. Sermons took on a solemn tone, words echoing through cold stone halls as priests reminded congregations to repent, to endure, to trust in providence. Yet even there, prayers were tinged with desperation, hands clasped tighter than ever, eyes closed a little longer. The air was thick with incense and unspoken dread. In cottages, whispers moved from hearth to hearth. Parents tried to shield their children from talk of famine, yet the little ones heard more than they were meant to. They saw the worry etched on faces, felt the hush that fell when they entered the room, and understood enough to sense that something was terribly wrong. At night, children dreamt of endless winters, of fields that would never bloom again, their fear shaped by the silences of their elders. The fear was not only of hunger, but of what hunger might bring. People remembered old tales of riots, of neighbors turning against one another when food ran out. They feared the return of sickness, for poor diets made bodies weaker, and already coughs lingered longer, fevers burned hotter. The thought of disease spreading through cold, hungry towns pressed down like a shadow heavier than the frost. And yet, not all fear was destructive. In many places, it bound people together. Families gathered nightly to share not just food but presents, for company was a balm against dread. Villagers walked home together after markets, candles in hand, their flickering light painting golden halos in the fog. Even fear, when shared, could be softened into solidarity. Still, as leaves withered too quickly and winds carried an icy bite, people could not escape the truth. The year without a summer had already tested them, and what lay ahead promised to be harsher still. Fear whispered in every quiet moment, reminding them that the hardest days had not yet come. By the time autumn should have mellowed into a season of gentle warmth and harvest hues, the land was instead bound by frost. It crept silently across fields in the night, painting every blade of grass with a delicate white edge. When morning came, the sun rose pale and weak, unable to melt the glittering layer until midday, and even then the chill clung stubbornly to the earth. Farmers knew this was not ordinary. Autumn frosts were not unheard of, but these were harsher, sharper, arriving weeks too early, and lasting far too long. The soil beneath their boots had hardened, clods breaking under plows with a sound like stone. Root crops, the last hope for many, were trapped beneath the frozen ground, small and twisted, difficult to pry free. The smell of earth, usually rich and sweet when turned, was instead sharp, metallic, and cold. The forests, too, bore the strangeness. Leaves that should have flamed in brilliant reds and golds instead withered into dull brown, falling too soon. Paths once soft with moss grew brittle underfoot, and the streams running through the woods carried an icy chill that nipped at fingers when touched. Travelers wrapped their cloaks tighter, their breath misting before them as though winter had arrived uninvited. In villages, the change was felt even more keenly. Windows were sealed early, shutters drawn tight against winds that whistled through cracks. Children, who would normally run laughing through piles of autumn leaves, stayed indoors, pressed close to fires, their play replaced by hushed conversations and quiet chores. The smell of wood smoke hung constantly in the air, thick and heavy, clinging to walls, hair, and clothes alike. Markets dwindled to almost nothing. What little remained from summer's meager yield was sold quickly, leaving stalls bare. The sound of coins clinking grew rarer, replaced by the sound of bargaining in kind, wool for grain, tools for potatoes, shoes for a handful of beans. Every transaction carried weight, for every family knew that winter, once it truly arrived, would show no mercy, and still people searched for hope. In quiet corners, seeds were set aside, carefully saved in pouches of cloth or jars of clay, a fragile promise for another spring. Mothers taught children to stitch warmer clothes from scraps, their fingers busy even in the dim glow of evening firelight. Songs were sung softly, stories told of past hardships endured, as if to remind each other that human resilience had always found a way. But the truth was plain in the morning frost, in the hollow barns, in the dim glow of weakened sunlight. Autumn had slipped away without offering its gifts, and winter was already at the door, knocking with icy hands. By mid-autumn, even the waterways began to betray the season. Rivers that should have flowed freely, reflecting the soft golds and reds of falling leaves, moved sluggishly, their surfaces rippled with ice forming along the edges. In some shallow streams, the frost crept across the water like fine lace, freezing the surface in delicate patterns that sparkled under the pale sunlight. Fishermen found their nets catching little. Fish, scarce and sluggish in the frigid currents, evaded the usual traps, leaving boats bobbing emptily in the cold waters. The smell of damp wood and river mud mixed with the sharp tang of frost, a scent that lingered on hands and clothes even after returning home. Children, who once delighted in skipping stones across rippling water, now stared in awe at the stillness, their laughter quieted by the unfamiliar hardness of the season. Along riverbanks, reeds and grasses were stiff with ice. Animals moved cautiously. Geese and ducks took flight earlier than usual, honking plaintively as they sought warmer waters. Dogs shivered in yards, and livestock huddled close in barns, the chill pressing its way into the thickest coats. Even the soil along the river's edge, normally soft from autumn rains, resisted footsteps, frozen and unyielding. In towns near the water, mills slowed. Water wheels creaked as they turned sluggishly, their motion hampered by icy coatings that built up overnight. Millers, once proud of their rhythm and productivity, now labored to keep their wheels turning, scraping ice and chipping frozen debris to coax the streams back to life. The air carried the damp, earthy scent of moss and wet stone, but beneath it lingered the bitter chill, a constant reminder of the year's abnormality. Families who relied on fishing or the river for transport found themselves adjusting. Paths that once led easily to the water became slick with frost, and carts slipped in mud hardened by ice. People learned caution in ways they had never needed before. Steps slowed, lanterns carried longer into the dark, hands wrapped in extra layers, and voices hushed against the wind that carried both cold and worry. Yet the rivers also offered moments of strange beauty. Sunlight, rare but golden, caught on frozen surfaces and scattered into 1,000 tiny prisms. The sound of cracking ice underfoot, though startling, became a rhythm of its own, a subtle reminder that even in hardship, the world was alive, and in that rhythm people found a small comfort, an acknowledgement that the earth, though harsh, had patterns that could be observed, respected, and understood. Still, with each day, the frost deepened, and the rivers grew colder, harder, a quiet herald of the long, harsh winter soon to come. As the cold deepened, hearths became the center of every home. The faint warmth of a fire was no longer merely comforting, it was essential. A fragile shield against the biting chill that crept through cracks in walls and around poorly fitted doors. Families clustered close, the orange glow painting soft, dancing shapes on the rough timber and stone that enclosed them. The smell of smoke mingled with every corner of the home. It coated hair and clothing, curled around wooden beams, and seeped into blankets and rugs. It was a scent that spoke of safety, yet carried an underlying sharpness, a reminder that warmth was fleeting and fragile. Parents fanned flames carefully, feeding logs one by one, aware that every stick of wood burned was one less to see them through the coming months. Evenings stretched long, dark, and silent, punctuated only by the crackle of fire and the occasional distant howl of the wind. Children sat close to parents, wrapped in layers of cloth, eyes wide as stories unfolded. Tales of past winters, of great storms survived and harvests saved, were told with deliberate calm, voices slow and soothing. The narratives carried a subtle magic, the ability to make the outside cold feel farther away, to transform fear into a shared sense of endurance. Flickering shadows danced across walls, creating shapes that seemed to move with a life of their own. A rocking chair's shadow stretched long and eerie. A cooking pot cast shapes that merged with those of the children huddled nearby. Some nights the shadows played tricks on the imagination, yet even imagined fears were softened by the presence of family, by the low hum of conversation, by the warmth of shared breath. Outside, the frost glistened under the moonlight, transforming the world into a landscape of silver and gray. Inside, the hearths were sanctuaries, the warmth wrapping around shoulders and hands, reminding all that even in the harshest season there was care, there was protection, there was human connection. Every flicker of flame was a promise, small but steadfast, that life would continue despite the frozen earth beyond the walls. And though the nights grew colder, the firelight became a quiet rhythm, a heartbeat in the dark that reassured even the youngest that they were safe, that the world, though strange and harsh, held beauty, warmth, and hope. As the days shortened and the sunlight grew weaker, a quiet melancholy settled over the land. The sun, pale and thin, struggled to rise above the horizon. Its light, when it arrived at all, fell in slanted silvery beams that barely warmed the earth. Shadows stretched long and cold across fields, streets, and forests, giving every familiar scene an unfamiliar edge. In towns, rooftops glistened with frost even in mid-morning. Windows, glazed over with condensation, reflected the weak sun in ghostly patterns. Smoke from hearths spiraled upward, catching the dim light and transforming into silvery threads that seemed to reach for the heavens. The faint warmth was deceptive, and anyone who lingered outside for long felt the chill pressing through coats and cloaks, sinking into skin and bones alike. Farmers grew increasingly anxious. Their fields, already damaged by frost and rain, seemed to shrink further under the sun's ineffectual rays. The crops that survived summer were dwarfed, pale, and thin. Vegetables failed to ripen, and fruit hung shriveled and tart on gnarled branches. The soil, cold and damp, resisted plowing, leaving the last planting efforts precarious at best. In homes, the waning sun dictated routines. Families rose and rested with the dim light, knowing that darkness would descend early. Windows were shuttered by mid-afternoon to keep warmth inside. Candles were lit hours before nightfall, their glow softening corners and filling rooms with golden reassurance. The scent of burning tallow or beeswax mingled with the lingering smells of hearth and food, creating an atmosphere both intimate and protective against the encroaching cold. Even the world beyond towns seemed altered. Rivers reflected the pale light in muted silver, their surfaces still cold, uninviting. Forests looked skeletal, as leaves had fallen too early, leaving stark branches that swayed and creaked in icy winds. Birds called less often, and insects had disappeared entirely, leaving a silence that pressed against ears in an almost tangible way. Yet amidst this muted world, moments of calm existed. Families paused to watch the low sun, marveling at the soft glow it lent to frost-covered fields. Children pressed their palms to windows, feeling the last touch of sunlight as they imagined distant lands bathed in warmth. It was a delicate balance, the chill of the season pressing close, yet the weak light offering glimpses of beauty, of a world still alive even in hardship. By late autumn, the reality of the year without a summer pressed heavily on every farm and village. Harvests, such as they were, seemed more like shadows of what should have been. Baskets held sparse clusters of vegetables. Pumpkins were small and mottled, their flesh thin. Apples and pears hung stubbornly on skeletal branches, shriveled and tart, tasting of frost more than sweetness. The fields themselves were a patchwork of disappointment. Where wheat should have risen golden, only thin, stunted stalks remained, their heads bent and brittle. Barley and oats struggled to find purchase in frozen soil, leaving gaps that turned green fields into uneven brown-edged expanses. Farmers walked slowly among them, hands brushing over the coarse stems, hoping for hidden strength, only to feel the cold, lifeless texture of failure. Animals, too, reflected the hardship. Cows chewed sparse grass with slow, weary movements. Sheep huddled in small groups, their coats thickened but insufficient against the damp chill. Chickens wandered the yards in search of seeds or worms that were harder to find, scratching at frost-hardened soil that offered little in return. The low murmur of their discontent mixed with the faint creak of barns and the distant rush of streams, creating a landscape alive with quiet struggle. In villages, the small harvests were celebrated cautiously. Families carried home their gathered goods, weighing them carefully, portioning even the smallest vegetables to ensure they lasted. Kitchens filled with the aroma of roasted roots and herbs gathered from hedgerows. Yet every meal carried an undertone of anxiety. Each bite was a reminder of scarcity, a test of patience, and a lesson in endurance. Evenings were spent planning, mending tools, and teaching children the skills of survival. Knives were sharpened, wheelbarrows patched, boots sewn with care. The air inside homes was warm from fires, but outside, frost pressed against doors and windows, a constant reminder that nature had become both opponent and teacher. And yet hope persisted. Every tiny sprout rescued from frost, every jar of preserved fruit tucked carefully into storage, became a triumph. Communities shared knowledge and resources, and small victories, like a pumpkin large enough to feed a family or a chicken that laid an egg despite the chill, were celebrated quietly like hidden treasures in a world that seemed intent on withholding abundance. As November approached, the winds began to shift with a sharper bite. They swept through valleys and across plains with an unrelenting force, bending trees and carrying the scent of frozen earth far into towns and villages. The gusts rattled shutters and doors, slipping through cracks to chase a chill into every corner of a home. Those who ventured outside wrapped themselves tightly in cloaks and scarves, feeling the cold bite through wool and leather alike. The wind seemed to carry whispers, too, hints of distant mountains, of snow-covered highlands, and of seas already edged with ice. Travelers spoke of unexpected blizzards on hilltops and of rivers beginning to solidify along their edges. Children pressed close to mothers as the gusts howled, their small faces pale with awe and a quiet fear. Even animals sought shelter, retreating into barns, dens, and thick brambles, sensing the harshness of what was to come. In towns, chimneys glimmered with constant smoke, filling streets with the sharp, comforting scent of wood and peat. Every hearth became not just warmth, but protection, a place to gather and share stories. The wind outside made voices soft, gentle, and slow, as if nature itself demanded calm and careful speech. People spoke less in marketplaces, their eyes searching the skies, their ears listening to the mournful cry of wind through empty branches. The cold brought with it new challenges. Thinly built cottages groaned under the strain of wind, doors rattling on hinges, windows rattling against frames. Farmers reinforced barns with extra planks and ropes, even as frost hardened the ground beneath their feet. Roads became treacherous, mud freezing into uneven patches, slowing carts and travelers alike. Every step outside required caution. Every task demanded effort, heightened by cold fatigue. Yet amidst the trials there were quiet victories. Families sat close around fires, mending clothing and sharing small meals, their laughter soft but genuine. Stories were told slowly, deliberately, like incantations against the harsh season. And in those moments, the wind, though relentless, became less a force of fear and more a reminder of endurance, a challenge to be met with patience, resilience, and the small comforts of home. Even as the days shortened further and the frosts deepened, people found a rhythm in the struggle. They learned the language of the wind, the patience of the frozen soil, and the beauty hidden in silvered fields and ice-kissed trees. The world was harsh, but it was alive, and life, they knew, must continue. In late November, the first true snow began to fall, softly at first, like scattered petals drifting from the sky. It was lighter than frost, delicate, and it blanketed the fields and rooftops in an unbroken white. At first people marveled at its quiet beauty, stepping outside to catch flakes on gloved hands or to watch the landscape transform into a dreamlike world. But the snow was not a gentle visitor. It was a reminder of the year's persistent strangeness. The layer that fell seemed heavier, wetter, and colder than any winter memory. Roads became slippery ribbons of ice and slush, and streams gained a thin sheen of frost that made travel hazardous. Livestock, accustomed to autumn's chill, huddled deeper in barns, their low murmurs echoing in the stillness. Birds, confused and hungry, gathered in small, uneasy flocks, their calls distant and plaintive. Villagers hurried to protect what remained of crops and stored food. Burlap sacks were reinforced with twine doors and windows sealed tighter, and hay stacked higher in barns. Every home became a fortress against the season. The smell of burning wood and peat thickened the air, comforting yet sharp with smoke. Children pressed close to hearths, watching the white world beyond their windows, imagining what winter might hold, feeling both awe and unease. The first snow transformed familiar places into landscapes, both enchanting and strange. Trees wore icy crowns, their bare branches outlined in white. Roofs glistened in the weak sunlight, and fields became a seamless quilt of frost and snow. Footsteps left dark impressions, reminders of human presence in a world suddenly hushed and blanketed. Even the wind seemed to change tone, sharper in the morning, quieter in the afternoon, as if listening along with the people below. Amid the wonder, daily life continued. Families rationed their food carefully, fires burned almost constantly, and chores took on new urgency. Water had to be thawed for cooking, paths cleared for animals, and clothing layered in heavier fabrics. Each small act of preparation carried a sense of survival, of mastering a world that had become unpredictable and cold. Yet, in the quiet of snowfall, there was also a strange comfort. The world seemed softer, muffled under the white blanket, as though the relentless hardships of the past months were paused, if only for a moment. And for those gathered near warm hearths, with children's laughter and the scent of smoke in the air, the snow offered a fragile sense of peace, a gentle pause before winter's full arrival. With the first snow came nights that were colder than anyone could remember. The air itself seemed to hold frost, wrapping around every roof, branch, and frozen stream. Inside cottages, the hearths were tended constantly, the flames fed with steady hands to chase back the creeping chill. Even with fires burning, families huddled together beneath layers of wool and cloth, the warmth of one another the most precious comfort. Outside, the moon glinted on icy fields, making them sparkle with a ghostly silver light. Frost-covered trees creaked under the weight of ice, their branches bending dangerously in the wind. The silence of the night was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of timber or the low murmur of animals seeking shelter. Each sound seemed magnified, echoing in the frozen air, a reminder of the fragility of life in such conditions. Children, pressed close to their parents, listened to the wind whistling around corners and rooftops. Their imaginations conjured scenes of vast frozen forests and snowbound mountains, while parents soothed their fears with soft songs and gentle stories. The warmth of shared presence became a shield against the world outside, a quiet insistence that they would endure together. Paths were slippery and treacherous, and only essential journeys were attempted. Milk had to be carried in insulated containers, firewood fetched before nightfall, and animals checked to ensure they had sufficient shelter and feed. Every task required care, every movement measured against the cold. Yet these routines, though exhausting, became rituals of resilience, each small victory a reassurance that survival was possible. Even the smallest details offered comfort, the scent of burning wood mixed with the faint sweetness of preserved fruits. Candles flickered gently, casting dancing shadows on frost-lined windows. The taste of warm broth or a thin slice of bread became a ritual of satisfaction, a moment of calm in otherwise harsh days. And though the nights were icy and long, they carried a rhythm that people could follow. The wind outside became a lullaby of sorts, and the fires inside offered a heartbeat of warmth. Each family learned to measure life in embers and blankets, in quiet songs and whispered assurances, slowly adapting to the relentless cold that had become their world. By mid-December, frost had claimed nearly every open field. What little remained of crops lay under a hard, icy crust, brittle to the touch and pale in color. Farmers walked carefully, boots crunching against frozen soil, hands numb even through thick gloves as they assessed the damage. Stalks that had survived wind and rain now snapped under the touch, their roots shriveled and unyielding. The air smelled sharp and metallic, carrying the scent of frozen earth mixed with smoke from chimneys. Even the smallest breeze seemed to cut like a knife, and the cold seeped into bones and joints, making every movement deliberate and slow. Livestock huddled together in barns, the low hum of animals echoing softly against walls and rafters. Chickens and geese pressed closer to warmth, their feathers fluffed as though holding invisible shields against the frost. Villages adjusted to the starkness, families rationed what remained of their meager stores more tightly. Bread was stretched thinner, soups flavored with herbs gathered from hedgerows, and porridge boiled longer to extract every bit of sustenance. Kitchens were warm, aromatic, and bustling with quiet industry, the flicker of hearths casting dancing shadows across walls, lined with jars of preserved vegetables and fruit. Even travel became a slow, cautious endeavor. Paths were slippery with ice, and carts dragged through hardened mud with difficulty. The market, though still operating, had become a place of measured steps and hushed voices. Sellers offered smaller quantities of goods, and neighbors spoke in whispers, sharing what they could while guarding what was left. Scarcity sharpened focus, and every decision carried weight. Amid the frost-bitten field, small moments of beauty endured. The sun, low in the sky, caught the crystalline frost in ways that made the world shimmer as if dusted with diamonds. Snowflakes clung to branches and fences, sparkling under the faint light. Children, bundled tightly, sometimes ventured outside, leaving tiny footprints that traced delicate patterns across white landscapes. Even in hardship, these glimpses of wonder reminded everyone that life, though challenged, still held subtle joys. And so the frost settled as both a threat and a teacher, one that pressed on bodies and spirits alike, yet demanded patience, care, and attention. Survival required attention to every detail, but within the struggle there was a rhythm, a slow and steady pulse that reminded people they could endure. As the cold deepened, the smell of smoke and soot became a constant companion in towns and villages. Every hearth burned almost continuously, feeding the need for warmth that had become all-consuming. The scent, sharp and earthy, clung to hair, clothing, and walls, creating an invisible shroud that marked the season's severity. Inside cottages, flames licked the sides of iron pots, casting flickering shadows on walls lined with clay jars and dried herbs. The hiss and pop of burning wood became a gentle soundtrack to daily life, soothing in its regularity, even as it reminded everyone of the unrelenting cold outside. Families huddled closer, shoulders touching, fingers intertwined, drawing not just heat, but comfort from each other's presence. The smoke itself seemed to carry stories. It swirled in the air, catching light and forming transient shapes on walls and ceilings. Children pointed and laughed quietly at shadows that resembled animals or faraway landscapes. Parents, though exhausted, smiled softly, grateful for the brief moments of distraction and wonder the smoke offered. Outside, the frost and snow pressed against windows, making them glisten under the pale light of a waning sun. Chimneys rose like blackened sentinels, their smoke curling upward and disappearing into the cold sky. The scent carried far, mingling with the crisp air, signaling warmth, safety, and human presence in an otherwise frozen world. Evenings were long, measured in embers and soot. People tended fires with care, feeding logs slowly to prolong heat. Meals were cooked with patience. A stew simmered over hours, allowing flavors to meld and the kitchen to fill with a comforting aroma. Every bite, every sip was savored, not just for nourishment, but for the warmth it brought, both to body and spirit. And though the air was filled with smoke and the landscape with frost, there was a rhythm, a quiet order. Each day began and ended with tending the fire, preparing meals, checking on animals, and sharing warmth. Life, though slowed by cold and scarcity, continued with a deliberate calm, a reminder that even in harsh times, human resilience and care endured. By late December, the streets of towns and villages were quieter than they had been in any other winter memory. The usual hum of daily activity, footsteps, chatter, the clatter of carts, was subdued, replaced by the crunch of frost under boots and the distant whistle of the wind through narrow alleys. Snow-muffled sounds blanketing streets in a hushed white silence that felt both beautiful and isolating. Shops and market stalls operated on a limited schedule. Doors were kept closed against the cold, and the few customers who ventured out moved slowly, speaking in quiet tones. Smoke rose constantly from chimneys, signaling warmth inside homes, while outside, icicles hung like glass daggers from eaves and fences, catching the faint sunlight and sparkling against the gray sky. Children rarely played in these streets, except in brief bursts when the snow was soft enough to build a small pile or catch flakes on gloved hands. Even then, their laughter was restrained, carried carefully as if mindful of the weight pressing upon every household. Parents watched from doorways and windows, calling softly, their voices gentle against the hush. Animals adapted to the cold as best they could. Horses stamped hooves against frozen ground, leaving shallow grooves in snow that marked the paths of daily life. Dogs padded carefully along icy stones, and cats, curled into tight balls, preferred the warmth of hearths to venturing outdoors. Livestock huddled within barns, creating faint, low murmurs that echoed in the stillness. Even in this quiet, signs of human ingenuity and endurance appeared. Paths were cleared with careful attention to ice, lanterns were lit earlier to guide travelers safely, and families coordinated firewood and food rations with precision. Every action, though simple, carried a sense of purpose, proof that life persisted, even under harsh and relentless conditions. And yet, the silence itself became a presence, almost tangible. It pressed against ears and hearts, a reminder of the season's weight and the fragility of comfort. In this hush, small gestures, a shared cup of tea, a whispered story, the flicker of a candle, became profound acts of connection, sustaining people through the long nights and icy days. By the end of December, the frost had claimed every window pane in the villages and towns. The glass was etched with delicate feathery patterns, twisting and curling, as though the cold had painted them in intricate artistry. Sunlight, when it filtered through, fell in pale, fractured beams, illuminating dust motes and the warm glow of hearths inside. Families pressed their hands against the glass, marveling at the crystalline patterns while feeling the chill seeping through the wood and panes. Children tapped the ice, leaving tiny fingerprints that disappeared almost immediately into the frozen design. Outside, snow drifted softly against the window sills, forming small mounds that glimmered under moonlight, further isolating the warmth within. The cold made households move differently. Doors creaked when opened, floors groaned under the strain of frozen boards, and blankets became the essential barrier against the biting air. Even simple tasks, carrying water, chopping firewood, tending animals, required extra care and attention. Every movement had to be deliberate, measured against the cold that threatened to sap strength and spirit. Inside, fires burned almost constantly. Smoke curled from chimneys, filling rooms with the sharp, earthy scent of burning wood. Kitchens were alive with the quiet rhythm of simmering stews, bread slowly browning, and the gentle clatter of utensils. Families huddled together, sharing warmth, whispers, and the small comforts of togetherness, their presence a soft shield against the frozen world outside. Even the village street seemed transformed by frozen windows. The world beyond was muffled, softened, and distant. Snow drifted silently against doors and fences, and the ice-lined paths reflected moonlight in gentle glimmers. Travelers moved slowly, careful not to slip on the hardening ground, their voices faint in the crisp, cold air. And yet, in this stillness, there was a certain magic. The frost traced its patterns like a delicate promise, a reminder that even in hardship, beauty persisted. The chill outside made the warmth inside all the more precious, a sanctuary of light, heat, and quiet human connection. Each frozen window pane became both barrier and lens, a way to witness the world's cold majesty while remaining safe and comforted. By early January, the snow had thickened across roads and footpaths, transforming familiar trails into unbroken stretches of white. Every step left a deep imprint, a temporary record of passage that would be quickly erased by drifting flakes or the gusting wind. Villagers moved carefully, boots crunching against packed snow, breaths forming small clouds that quickly vanished in the frigid air. Travel became an exercise in patience. Carts carrying firewood or food creaked and groaned, wheels struggling against frozen ruts and powdery drifts. Horses labored beneath their loads, muscles tense, hooves slipping on icy patches. Children, bundled in layers of wool, followed behind adults, sometimes slipping or laughing quietly at the unexpected softness of snow underfoot. Every journey was slower, every errand more deliberate, but necessity kept life moving forward. The landscape itself was transformed. Fields, once brown or patchy, were now uniform sheets of white, interrupted only by the dark lines of fences or the bare limbs of frost-covered trees. Forests seemed quieter, more solemn, as snow clung to every branch, muffling sounds and creating a hushed, almost sacred atmosphere. Streams reflected the pale winter sun, their surfaces glinting with ice that made water look frozen in time. Villagers adapted in small ways. Footpaths were swept or trodden down to create walkable routes. Lanterns were placed along streets to guide late travelers, and families marked the edges of property with sticks or posts to avoid losing their way. The work was steady, repetitive, but it gave structure to days that might otherwise have felt endless under the weight of snow and frost. Evenings offered moments of calm. Candlelight flickered against snow-laden windows, fires crackled with warmth, and quiet conversation filled homes. The outside world, though harsh and cold, became a backdrop for human resilience and connection. Families shared meals slowly, savoring each bite, while stories of past winters and faraway lands wove a thread of continuity and hope. And through it all, the snow-covered paths reminded everyone that even in the midst of relentless cold, movement and progress were possible. Each careful step became a small triumph, a testament to endurance, patience, and the quiet determination that sustained life during the year without a summer. By mid-January, the cold was so penetrating that every exhaled breath became visible, curling into small clouds of white that lingered for a moment before dissipating into the frozen air. People spoke in hushed tones, their words drifting in the frigid wind like delicate smoke, carried farther than intended and vanishing quickly. Children's laughter, when it escaped, puffed into icy bursts that hung briefly before dissolving. The air itself carried a sharpness that made the lungs ache. Each inhale brought the scent of frost, wood smoke, and damp earth, mingling into a crisp, metallic perfume. Lips cracked easily, cheeks burned red against the cold, and fingers, even in gloves, stiffened with every task. Everyone moved deliberately, mindful of the invisible frost that could pierce skin and chill bones. Within homes, the contrast with the world outside could not have been more striking. Fires glowed warmly, filling rooms with the rich scent of burning wood. Thick blankets provided cocoon-like protection, and hot drinks steamed in cups, their aromas comforting the senses. Every shared meal, every soft word or gentle touch became a quiet celebration of human warmth against the biting cold beyond the walls. Even the simplest actions were affected. Drawing water from frozen wells required careful effort. Kindling had to be chipped and fanned into life with patience. Doors groaned under icy hinges. Each movement carried a heightened awareness, a rhythm of adaptation learned slowly over weeks of relentless cold. Outside, landscapes shimmered under frost. Tree branches glittered like crystal, snow sparkled in pale sunlight, and the breath of animals mingled with that of humans, tiny clouds rising and fading in synchronized patterns. Travelers and villagers alike learned to pace themselves, respecting the power of the frozen air while finding ways to continue daily life. And yet, amidst the frozen breath and aching muscles, there was beauty. Each exhale, fleeting as it was, became a small testament to life's persistence, a visible proof that even in harshest conditions warmth, movement, and human presence endured. The year without a summer had brought hardship, but it had also revealed resilience in every living breath. By late January, the hearth had become more than a source of warmth. It was the heart of every home. Families gathered around the flames for hours each day, the firelight painting gentle golden glows across walls lined with frost-laced windows. The rhythmic crackle of burning wood became a steady comfort, a quiet pulse against the relentless cold pressing from outside. Every movement near the hearth was deliberate. Chairs were positioned carefully, blankets draped strategically, and children nestled close to parents or siblings, feeling the heat radiate across shoulders and hands. The scent of smoke mingled with the faint aroma of simmering stews, roasted roots, or brewed herbs, creating an atmosphere that was both protective and calming. Evenings were spent in routines that strengthened both body and spirit. Clothes were mended by lamplight, bread kneaded slowly and with care, and small chores, feeding animals, checking supplies, were completed before night fully descended. The hearth offered a stage for conversation, laughter, storytelling, and gentle instruction. Each word, each gesture became an act of reassurance in a world that had grown sharp and unpredictable. The cold outside made the warmth inside all the more precious. The wind rattling doors and icy frost pressing at windows reminded everyone of the fragility of comfort. Fires were tended not only for warmth but as symbols of resilience, of life continuing in defiance of frost and snow. Even brief moments of distraction, watching sparks rise from the flames, sharing a story, tasting a morsel of preserved fruit, felt magnified, precious, against the harshness of the season. Children's imaginations flourished near the hearth, shadows cast by flames danced like mysterious creatures on the walls, and simple objects became sources of wonder. Parents encouraged stories and songs, drawing their young ones into shared narratives that built courage, patience, and quiet hope. The warmth became more than heat. It became a balm, a subtle teaching of endurance and togetherness. And through the long nights, the hearth's embrace offered not only physical warmth, but a profound emotional anchor. In its glow, families found reassurance, strength, and gentle joy, learning to carry the resilience of fire within themselves as the cold world pressed relentlessly beyond the walls. By the end of January, window sills were lined with frost so thick that it created miniature ridges and crystalline patterns along the edges of every pane. The cold seeped through even the smallest gaps, leaving tiny ice crystals on the inside of glass and dusting wooden frames with a pale shimmer. Sunlight, when it arrived, refracted through these frozen patterns, scattering specks of light across floors and walls like tiny stars. Families observed these icy formations with quiet fascination. Children pressed their fingertips against the frost, leaving fleeting marks that vanished almost immediately. Parents watched with gentle smiles, appreciating how, even in hardship, the world offered glimpses of beauty. The frost became a silent companion, a reminder that life continued, even when abundance and warmth were scarce. Inside, the contrast between frost-lined windows and the glowing hearth was pronounced. Fires crackled and flared, their warmth pressing back against the cold that sought to intrude. Blankets were pulled tight, hot drinks sipped slowly, and soft conversations carried through rooms scented with smoke and the faint tang of preserved foods. Every action, however mundane, felt deliberate and meaningful, a small victory against the frozen world outside. Animals also adapted to the cold, gathering close to warmth wherever they could. Even daily chores were infused with awareness of the cold. Drawing water from half-frozen wells, chopping firewood, tending to animals, all required patience and care. Each task, accomplished in spite of biting frost, reinforced a sense of accomplishment and resilience. And yet there was quiet wonder in the icy windowsills. The frost traced fleeting, intricate designs that shifted with every temperature change, offering a small but persistent reminder of nature's artistry. In these moments, even in scarcity and cold, people found beauty, patience, and a subtle reassurance that life, though fragile, continued to endure. By early February, the cold seemed to seep not only through doors and windows, but through the very walls of homes. Timber groaned and stone shivered as frost crept along its surfaces, carrying tiny whispering sounds that echoed softly in empty corners. Every house seemed alive with subtle noises, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of frozen beams, the gentle tapping of ice against window panes. Families became attuned to these whispers. The quiet sounds of the house became a rhythm, a reminder that life persisted despite the harsh season. Children lay awake for brief moments, listening to the gentle music of frost and wind before settling back into warmth beneath blankets. Adults, too, moved with awareness, their steps soft, their voices measured, maintaining harmony with the subtle orchestra of the cold. Inside their homes, families relied on the steady warmth of the hearth. Meals were shared slowly, conversation deliberate, every gesture infused with care and purpose, forming a buffer against the penetrating chill outside. Even animals responded to the whispers. Cats shifted closer to fires, ears flicking at tiny creaks, while dogs padded carefully across frozen floors, alert to every subtle noise. Livestock huddled in tighter clusters, low murmurs blending with the ambient sound of frost and timber. Nature, it seemed, was mirrored inside, alive, responsive, and persistent. Outside, winds pressed against doors and windows with persistent insistence, carrying the scent of ice, snow, and distant pine. Footsteps on hardened paths crunched with authority, announcing the movement of those braving the frozen world. Every journey, every chore required patience, focus, and attention, reinforcing the rhythm of endurance that had grown over months of relentless cold. And so the whispers through the walls became both companion and teacher. They reminded families of the fragility of comfort, the value of care, and the quiet strength that could be found in observation, patience, and presence. Life endured not in spite of the cold, but alongside it, creating a rhythm of resilience that carried every household through long nights and frosted mornings. By mid-February, the ice had grown heavy on rooftops, fences, and trees. Every branch sagged under the weight of frost. Every rooftop groaned as snow and ice pressed down relentlessly. Villagers watched warily, knowing that sudden cracks or falls could damage homes, barns, and livestock shelters. The world seemed both beautiful and fragile, glittering in pale sunlight, yet tense with the potential for collapse. Walking through the countryside required care. Each step could disturb brittle, ice-laden branches, and the snow beneath sometimes concealed hazards, frozen puddles, hidden rocks, or uneven ground. Farmers approached their fields slowly, assessing the stubbornly frozen soil, running fingers over ice-encrusted crops that had managed to survive the long winter. Their hands, stiff and red from cold, brushed over brittle stalks and frost-crusted leaves, a tactile reminder of the year's relentless hardship. Inside homes, families were increasingly vigilant. Roofs were inspected for heavy accumulation of snow. Fires were fed with meticulous attention, for every ember mattered. Blankets and warm clothing were layered in multiple folds, and meals became more substantial, designed to sustain energy through arduous work outdoors. The scent of burning wood mingled with rich, simmering foods, filling rooms with warmth and reassurance. Even animals felt the pressure of ice. Horses huddled near barns shifting weight to avoid frozen ground, and livestock shifted in tight clusters, low murmurs vibrating against the chill. Chickens and ducks sought shelter in every nook, their feathers fluffed like tiny coats of insulation. Nature itself seemed aware of its burden, moving carefully, conserving energy wherever possible. Yet, amidst the weight and tension, moments of wonder persisted. Even in the cold, the frozen landscape held a stark beauty. Children, when allowed brief excursions, left prints across untouched snow, their joy a small rebellion against the season's severity. The weight of ice pressed down, yes, but it also highlighted the resilience of every living being, of every home, and of every heart, enduring the year without a summer. By late February, roofs throughout towns and villages were layered thickly with frost and snow, forming hard, sparkling caps that glistened in the pale sunlight. Each morning revealed a fresh pattern, crystalline textures, miniature ridges, and delicate overhangs that caught the wind and shimmered like fragile glass. Families marveled at the silent artistry, even as they worked to prevent the weight from causing damage. The snow and ice made routine tasks more challenging. Chimneys had to be cleared carefully to allow smoke to escape. Thatched roofs were inspected for sagging, and tiles or shingles were brushed gently to prevent cracking under the weight. Every action was measured, deliberate, and filled with both caution and awe, acknowledging the quiet power of winter's persistence. Inside, warmth remained sacred. Fires glowed brightly, their heat pressing back against windows iced over with delicate patterns. Families huddled near the hearth, sipping hot drinks that steamed into the cold air and savoring meals prepared slowly to stretch supplies. Conversations were soft and soothing, voices blending with the low crackle of firewood, creating a comforting rhythm that contrasted the icy severity outside. Animals adapted to the frozen roofs above. Birds perched carefully on icicle-laden eaves, their tiny claws gripping cautiously, while cats and dogs moved indoors as much as possible, seeking warmth and safety. Livestock remained in well-insulated barns, low murmurs and huffs blending with the creak of timber and the occasional drip of melting ice. Even the streets were transformed by frosted roofs. Snow fell in layers, muffling sounds and softening edges, while lanterns cast warm circles of light that reflected on the icy surfaces above. Travelers tread carefully, aware of potential hazards from overhanging ice or frozen tiles, and children watched with fascination from below, dreaming of magical lands sculpted entirely of frost. Through the beauty and challenges of frosted roofs, life continued. Careful attention, patience, and shared warmth allowed communities to endure, finding both resilience and quiet wonder in the harsh, shimmering winter. By early March, the streams that had survived the harsh frost were now lined with sheets of ice, their waters slowed and subdued under the persistent cold. The gentle burble of flowing water had become a muted murmur, muffled beneath icy coverings that reflected the pale winter sun. Each stream looked like a silver ribbon frozen in time, delicate patterns forming along the edges where water still trickled. Fishermen walked cautiously along the banks, their boots crunching over frost-hardened soil and thin ice. Nets that once yielded fish now came up empty, or with only the smallest, weakest of the catch. The damp, earthy scent of riverbanks mingled with the sharp tang of ice, creating an aroma that spoke both of life and hardship. Children peered at the streams, amazed at the glittering surface, and sometimes tapped lightly with sticks, watching ripples struggle against frozen edges. Villagers relied on streams for more than fishing. Water was collected for cooking and cleaning, requiring careful scraping of ice and careful handling to avoid freezing. Every bucket brought indoors became precious, warmed by proximity to the hearth before use. The rhythms of daily life adjusted to the stream's icy temperament, teaching patience and caution in every movement. Animals responded to the frozen waters in subtle ways. Ducks and geese gathered in open patches, their calls distant and plaintive, while other wildlife retreated into thicker brush or forested areas, conserving energy and heat. Livestock at farms pressed near barns and troughs, awaiting carefully rationed water, their low murmurs blending with the occasional drip from melting ice. Yet, even amidst hardship, the streams offered quiet beauty. Sunlight refracted off icy surfaces, scattering glimmers across nearby snow, while frost patterns along the edges resembled delicate lace. Observing these frozen waters became a meditative act, a reminder that life persisted in subtle, patient ways. In the shimmer of ice, villagers found moments of calm, resilience, and hope, proof that even in the year without a summer, nature held its artistry and its gentle rhythm. By mid-March, the surrounding forests had transformed into realms of silver and white. Each branch, twig, and leaf was coated with frost, creating a quiet, sparkling cathedral of ice. The trees, stripped of their summer foliage long ago, stood solemn and intricate, their skeletal forms softened by the thick frost that clung to every surface. Walking among the frosted forests was both enchanting and eerie. Footsteps crunched over frozen underbrush, breaking the silence with a deliberate rhythm. Every sound, the distant call of a crow, the soft tap of icicles falling from branches, was magnified in the hushed world. The air smelled of damp wood, ice, and the faint hint of pine, a mixture both sharp and comforting, grounding those who wandered within. Wildlife adapted to the frozen woods. Deer moved cautiously, leaving delicate tracks in the snow, while smaller creatures burrowed into the thick undergrowth to escape the cold. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their movements careful and measured, as the frozen landscape limited their usual freedom. Even the streams threading through the forest mirrored the season's stillness, flowing slowly beneath ice-coated banks. Villagers occasionally ventured into these woods for firewood or herbs, careful to navigate slippery branches and hidden obstacles. Axes bit slowly into frost-hardened wood, each strike deliberate and measured. The cold made even simple work a trial, yet it also reinforced the value of preparation, patience, and awareness. Inside homes, the contrast with the frozen forests was striking. Fires glowed warmly, blankets and layered clothing offered comfort, and the aroma of cooking meals filled the air. Children listened to stories of distant summers and imagined green forests, their minds painting warmth onto the icy landscapes visible from frost-lined windows. Amid the frosted forests, there was both challenge and beauty. The glittering ice reminded villagers of nature's persistence, resilience, and artistry. Every trek into the woods became an exercise in careful observation, quiet endurance, and deep appreciation for the small, sparkling details of a world suspended in frost. By late March, the orchards that once promised fruit were now solemn groves of frost-covered branches. Trees that had been heavy with blossoms and leaves in previous years stood bare and brittle, their limbs coated in layers of ice that glinted like crystal in the weak sunlight. Any remaining buds were tiny and shriveled, clinging stubbornly to branches as if holding on to hope against the relentless cold. Walking through the frozen orchard was a quiet, almost reverent experience. Each step crunched over snow-covered ground, and the occasional snap of an ice-laden branch echoed sharply through the still air. The scent was a mix of damp earth, frozen bark, and lingering traces of blossoms past, faint, sweet, and melancholic. Birds flitted cautiously between branches, searching for seeds or insects that were increasingly scarce, their small movements breaking the profound silence. Farmers examined the trees carefully, hands numbed even through gloves, feeling the brittle bark and inspecting each branch for hidden damage. They whispered to themselves as they moved, a quiet language of patience and endurance, marking which trees might survive and which would need careful tending in the coming months. Each tree became a lesson in resilience, a reminder that life, though strained, could endure with care. Inside nearby cottages, families reflected the orchard's stillness in their routines. Fires burned constantly, casting warm golden light onto walls lined with jars of preserved fruits and herbs. Meals were prepared with meticulous attention, each dish a small triumph in a season of scarcity. Conversations were soft, deliberate, and comforting, punctuated by the occasional hum or laughter that rose gently above the low crackle of firewood. Many quietly imagined the return of warmer seasons. Parents joined them, sharing stories of warmer years, and in that quiet exchange, hope persisted, soft, patient, and enduring, like the buds clinging to frozen branches. Even amidst frost and scarcity, the frozen orchard offered lessons in beauty, patience, and resilience. Its icy splendor reminded everyone that though the year without a summer was harsh, the seeds of life and warmth still waited beneath the frozen surface, ready to emerge when time and care allowed. By early April, the mornings were shrouded in thick, cold mists that crept slowly across fields, villages, and frozen streams. The fog clung to rooftops and trees, curling in ethereal tendrils that softened the harsh outlines of frost-covered landscapes. Every breath of air carried the chill and dampness of the mist, enveloping villagers in a quiet, almost otherworldly embrace. The mist muted sounds, creating a hushed world where even footsteps seemed softer. Cows lowed distantly through the gray haze, and chickens clucked faintly from coops, their voices muffled by the dense, damp air. The usual bustle of morning activity slowed, with travelers and farmers moving cautiously, aware that the veil of mist could hide icy patches or hidden obstacles. Every surface glistened with moisture as droplets formed on frost and ice, catching faint sunlight and reflecting it in soft, muted sparkles. Footpaths became slippery with the thin sheen of water over frozen ground, and windows were streaked with condensation, revealing only vague shapes of trees and buildings beyond. The air smelled of damp earth, smoke from chimneys, and the lingering scent of winter's decay, a complex, grounding aroma that reminded people of both endurance and fragility. Inside homes, the hearth became a sanctuary against the misty cold. Fires burned brighter, casting warm, flickering light that pierced the gray atmosphere outside. Kitchens were alive with the slow rhythm of breakfast preparation. Porridge simmered, bread warmed, and herbal teas steamed in small cups. The sounds of family life, soft and deliberate, became a comforting counterpoint to the muted world beyond frosted windows. Children, peering through condensation-streaked glass, imagined magical lands hidden in the gray veil. Parents encouraged their quiet musings, sharing gentle stories of past springs and distant summers. Even as the frost lingered in hidden corners, the mist offered a soft, contemplative beauty, reminding all who watched that even in hardship, the world held spaces of wonder, quiet reflection, and patient hope. By mid-April, the weight of lingering snow pressed heavily on every branch in forests, orchards, and hedgerows. Trees bowed under the burden, their limbs glittering with frost and ice, creating arches and tunnels of white that transformed familiar paths into dreamlike corridors. The snow clung stubbornly, refusing to melt even as the days grew slightly longer, a testament to the lingering severity of the year without a summer. Walking through the snow-laden branches required care. Every step produced a soft crunch that echoed faintly, the muted sounds amplified by the quiet of frozen woods. Sometimes a sudden drip or crack signaled the slow release of ice from a bending branch, startling birds or sending a flake cascade to the ground. The air smelled of wet wood, frozen earth, and the faint metallic tang of lingering frost, creating a sensory tapestry both sharp and soothing. Villagers who ventured into the woods for firewood or herbs moved deliberately, balancing axes in careful swings and gauging each step over hidden hazards. Each felled branch required patience to maneuver, and bundles of wood were carried slowly back to homes, each step a reminder of endurance and meticulous care. Animals adapted to the weighty snow in their own ways. Birds huddled in thick branches for shelter, fluffs of feathers pressed tight against their bodies. Deer moved carefully, leaving delicate tracks in snow that quickly became partially obscured by drifting flakes. Even small woodland creatures navigated cautiously, conserving energy as food sources remained scarce. Inside homes, families observed the snow-laden branches from frost-lined windows, appreciating the silent artistry even as they counted their rations and tended fires. The soft glow of the hearth illuminated interiors while meals were shared slowly, providing both nourishment and reassurance. Children whispered imaginatively about hidden creatures and fairy tale realms among the snow-covered limbs, and adults joined in, letting wonder coexist with the discipline of survival. The snow-laden branches became a symbol of resilience. They bore the harshness of the cold with grace, bending but not breaking, glittering even in adversity. And in that quiet, gentle endurance, villagers found encouragement, an unspoken lesson that strength and beauty could coexist even in the harshest of seasons. By late April, twilight stretched longer over the frost-bitten landscape, painting the sky in muted shades of lavender, pale gold, and soft gray. The sun hung low, weak and hesitant, filtering through lingering clouds and casting elongated shadows across snow-covered fields and icy rooftops. The light was gentle yet somber, illuminating the world in a subdued glow that emphasized both beauty and hardship. Villagers took their tasks slowly during these long twilights. Fires were stoked before nightfall, meals prepared with care, and animals checked one last time before the darkness pressed fully across the land. Every movement was deliberate, measured against the encroaching chill, and each small success, a warm room, a full belly, a protected animal, was savored quietly. The air carried both crispness and the faint scent of thawing earth. Frost lingered stubbornly in shaded areas, glittering under the fading light, while small rivulets of water began to whisper along thawing paths. The soft trickle of melting ice was a delicate counterpoint to the hush of long evening shadows, a quiet reminder that change, though slow, was coming. Children lingered near windows, watching the sky's slow gradient shift with fascination. Parents joined them, offering gentle explanations of the sun's journey and stories of warmer seasons to come. Inside, the hearth's warmth contrasted with the dim light outside, creating a sanctuary where soft voices, quiet laughter, and the rhythmic crackle of firewood provided comfort and stability. Even the woods took on a unique serenity during the long twilight. Frosted branches glimmered faintly, while snowdrifts softened the forest floor into smooth, luminous waves. Wildlife moved cautiously, often unseen, leaving delicate traces in the snow that told silent stories of survival and adaptation. In the calm of these extended twilights, life felt slower, gentler, and more reflective. The world held its breath between day and night, and villagers, too, embraced the pause, savoring warmth, companionship, and the quiet wonder of a landscape at once harsh and mesmerizing. The long twilight reminded all who watched that, even in adversity, moments of peace and reflection persisted. By early May, the few wooden bridges that crossed streams and rivers were now encased in layers of ice, their surfaces slick and glistening. Each crossing required careful steps, boots gripping cautiously against frozen planks, while the faint sound of water flowing beneath added a soft, liquid hum to the otherwise hushed landscape. The bridges, once simple passages, had become delicate obstacles demanding attention and respect. Villagers approached crossings slowly, sometimes using sticks for support or testing each plank before fully trusting their weight. The wind above the streams whipped sharply, carrying the scent of cold water mixed with frost and wet earth. Even the smallest misstep could result in a slip, so focus and patience became essential companions for anyone traveling along these icy paths. Below the bridges, water flowed sluggishly beneath sheets of ice, the current muted but persistent. Occasionally, a crack in the ice sent small ripples across the surface, and tiny fish trapped in shallow pools stirred weakly, reminders of life persevering despite harsh conditions. Birds perched cautiously along frozen rails, watching the water with alert eyes, wings tucked close to conserve warmth. Inside nearby homes, fires burned steadily, and families shared quiet meals while listening to the muffled sounds of the frozen rivers outside. The scent of smoke mingled with warm bread, stews, and herbs, creating a comforting barrier against the cold that pressed relentlessly on every structure. Children drew imaginary bridges in the frost-lining windows, tracing paths over icy streams and envisioning worlds of adventure and resilience. Even as travel remained difficult, the ice-covered bridges became symbols of careful passage and cautious hope. They connected villages, streams, and fields while demanding vigilance, patience, and respect. Each crossing was a quiet triumph, a reminder that life continued steadily even when the world was coated in frost and the year without a summer pressed its weight upon every path. By mid-May, the meadows, usually vibrant with spring growth, were still locked in ice and frost. Grass blades lay stiff and brittle beneath a sparkling white layer, and wildflowers, if they had survived at all, were reduced to fragile buds, trembling in the chill. The landscape seemed suspended in time, a frozen tableau that captured both the harshness and the strange beauty of the long winter. Villagers walked carefully across these meadows, mindful of icy patches that could send a foot slipping unexpectedly. Their boots left crisp imprints in the hardened ground, patterns that would soon be erased by drifting snow or frost settling overnight. The scent of damp earth and lingering frost mixed with smoke from distant chimneys, creating an aroma both grounding and sharp, reminding everyone of the world's persistence in the cold. Animals moved with caution through the meadows. Deer left delicate hoofprints in the frozen grass, while rabbits and smaller creatures found refuge under low shrubs and snow-covered mounds. Birds occasionally ventured across the open fields, flitting quickly between frozen patches and sparse trees, their calls faint and careful. Life, though constrained, found subtle ways to endure. Within homes, families adapted to the lingering frost of meadows. Fireplaces burned continuously, and meals were prepared with added care to ensure sustenance lasted. Hot drinks steamed in cups, blankets were pulled tight, and quiet stories or songs filled rooms with warmth. Children imagined the meadows as enchanted lands where icy grass shimmered like gemstones and small hidden creatures waited for spring's eventual return. The frozen meadows, though a reminder of scarcity and delay, held their own quiet magic. The ice captured light in subtle glimmers, the silence emphasized small sounds, and the persistence of life, hidden and careful, spoke to resilience. Villagers, moving slowly and thoughtfully through these fields or observing them from hearth-lit windows, learned patience, vigilance, and the gentle art of finding beauty even when the world seemed suspended in frost. By late May, the occasional rain that fell was sharp and frigid, turning soil into sticky mud and adding a glossy sheen to frost-covered fields. Each droplet seemed to bite as it landed, soaking woolen garments and chilling skin, making travelers and villagers move with deliberate care. The smell of wet earth mixed with the lingering scent of smoke from fires, creating a pungent yet familiar aroma that reminded everyone of both struggle and endurance. Villagers adjusted their routines to cope with the cold rain. Cloaks were drawn tight, hoods pulled low, and boots trudged slowly through slippery paths. Farmers inspected crops and frozen fields, hands numb even with gloves trying to gauge what the cold rain had spared or further damaged. Each step required attention, as frozen ground could turn treacherously slick beneath wet surfaces. Animals sought shelter during the chilled rain. Horses and cattle huddled in barns, their low hums echoing against frost-lined beams. Dogs shook themselves near hearths, ears flicking at the muted sound of droplets against roofs, while birds tucked under branches, wings pressed close to conserve warmth. The world seemed to shrink, each creature and human moving cautiously within their protective spaces. Inside homes, fires burned brighter against the damp chill that crept through walls and windows. Stews simmered longer, porridge was served steaming hot, and warm drinks offered both comfort and sustenance. Children watched droplets race down frost-lined windows, imagining them as tiny streams in enchanted lands, while adults quietly marveled at the persistent rhythms of survival. Even as the chilled rain added weight and challenge to daily life, it brought subtle reminders of resilience. Water nourished roots hidden beneath frozen soil, drops glistened like tiny jewels in weak sunlight, and life, though slowed, continued to endure. The season, harsh and relentless, tested patience, but it also revealed the quiet strength and adaptability of every living thing that pressed on through ice, snow, and rain. By early June, the wind had grown sharp and insistent, carrying ice particles and chilling drafts across fields, streets, and forests. Each gust whistled through chimneys, alleyways, and between buildings, sending shivers through even the warmest layers of clothing. The air felt electric with cold, biting at exposed skin and leaving a lingering tingling on cheeks and fingers. Villagers adapted by layering clothing, tucking scarves tightly around their faces, and hunching shoulders as they moved. Even routine chores became deliberate acts, opening doors slowly, tending fires quickly, and keeping animals sheltered from the persistent gusts. The icy wind dictated the pace of life, forcing everyone into careful, measured rhythms. In forests and orchards, the wind tugged at frozen branches, causing icicles to sway or drip faintly. Trees groaned under the pressure, and snow that had resisted melting earlier now shifted in soft avalanches, brushing the frozen ground below. Birds and small animals clung to shelter wherever possible, wings and paws pressed close to conserve warmth, while deer and livestock moved cautiously, aware of every sudden shift in the air. Inside homes, the contrast with the icy wind outside was comforting and profound. Fires glowed warmly, filling rooms with crackling sound and a rich, earthy scent. Families huddled together, sharing meals slowly and savoring the rare sweetness of preserved fruits or warmed bread. Children pressed close to parents or siblings felt the wind's chill only as a distant presence, softened by blankets, flames, and the gentle rhythm of life indoors. The icy wind, though relentless, brought subtle beauty. Frost swirled across windows, glinting in stray sunlight. The hiss and whistle of air through trees created an eerie, musical quality, and each careful movement, each cozy evening by the hearth, reinforced resilience. Villagers learned to respect the wind's power while finding peace within, a quiet balance of endurance and comfort as the year without a summer pressed onward. By mid-June, subtle changes began appearing at the edges of frozen streams and snow-drifted fields. Ice that had dominated for months showed signs of softening, small rivulets appearing where water once had been fully locked beneath frost. The sound of trickling water returned gently, barely audible at first, adding a delicate music to the muted landscape. Villagers noticed these thawing edges with cautious hope. Farmers inspected fields for signs of soil loosening, testing frozen ground with sticks or gloved hands. Children peered eagerly at the small patches of water forming near streams, imagining them as portals to warmer, livelier lands. Even the smallest signs of thaw inspired quiet optimism in households long accustomed to persistent cold. The air grew slightly less biting, though each gust still carried an edge. Damp earth mingled with the lingering scent of smoke, ice, and decayed leaves, creating a complex, grounding aroma. Animals responded similarly. Ducks moved more confidently along streams, deer ventured closer to thawing patches of grass, and smaller creatures emerged cautiously from under protective snow mounds, sensing opportunities for food and mobility. Inside homes, warmth remained crucial, but routines shifted subtly in response to the thaw. Windows could be opened briefly to allow fresher air, and stored water supplies needed less heating for use in cooking and cleaning. Families celebrated small signs of progress, streams trickling again, thawing snow revealing soft soil, or the faint greening of stubborn plants, while still respecting the cold that lingered in shaded areas and during the night. The thawing edges became a quiet teacher of patience and observation. Life, though slow to resume its former vibrancy, persisted patiently beneath ice and snow. Villagers learned to notice subtle changes, to adapt with careful attention, and to savor even the smallest signs of warmth and growth. In these thawing margins, hope began to creep gently back into a world long constrained by frost and relentless winter. By late June, despite the lengthening days and warmer sun, frost lingered stubbornly in shaded valleys on northern-facing slopes and in the crevices of stone walls. Even as the world outside promised early summer, these pockets remained icy, holding on to winter's memory with quiet persistence. Tiny crystals glimmered in the morning light, delicate and intricate, refusing to yield entirely to the growing warmth. Villagers tread carefully through these lingering frost pockets. Every step over hardened soil or thin ice required attention, and tools used in fields or gardens had to be handled with caution to avoid cracking brittle ground. The scent of damp earth mingled with residual cold, producing an aroma that was simultaneously fresh and haunting, a reminder of months of relentless chill. Animals also responded to these stubborn frosts. Birds cautiously explored the newly exposed ground, occasionally pecking at frozen soil. Deer approached thawing streams warily, and smaller creatures, Rabbits, mice, and hedgehogs emerged slowly, testing the air for lingering threats. Livestock, accustomed to months of harsh weather, moved with deliberate caution, sensing cold in patches where humans might have already assumed warmth had arrived. Inside homes, the contrast remained striking. Fires burned, but their warmth felt even more precious against the unexpected cold that lingered at night or in shaded corners. Families adjusted routines to accommodate frost that refused to leave, gathering extra blankets, leaving warm water accessible, and checking fields or gardens for frost damage. Each successful task, each warm meal, and each moment of comfort became a quiet triumph over the persistent chill. The lingering frost taught a lesson in patience and acceptance. Even as change approached, the cold reminded villagers that nature followed its own slow rhythm, not always aligned with human desire. Observing the glimmering frost, noticing the cautious movements of animals, and feeling the warmth of hearth and home, people embraced resilience, patience, and quiet wonder, learning that life's persistence could coexist with hardship, even when winter's memory refused to fade completely. By early July, even as hints of warmth began to touch the land, many roads remained buried beneath stubborn snowdrifts. Paths that were once familiar and well-trodden now disappeared under soft, uneven mounds, forcing travelers to navigate carefully step by step. Every footprint left in the snow was temporary, soon covered by shifting flakes or gusts of icy wind, a reminder of nature's quiet authority over the landscape. Villagers adapted by creating makeshift markers along critical routes, stakes, bundled twigs, or small piles of stones, to guide travelers safely. Horses and carts struggled across these drifted paths, hooves and wheels slipping, while travelers leaned heavily on staffs for balance. The soundscape was filled with soft crunches, occasional groans of timber under pressure, and the distant creak of wagons laboring through frozen terrain. The air carried the lingering scent of snow and frost, mixed with earthy aromas from exposed soil and wood smoke drifting from chimneys. Even as the sun rose higher, the chill remained persistent, reminding villagers of the winter that refused to fully release its grip. Clothing was layered thickly, scarves wound tightly, and gloves doubled to keep frost at bay during long journeys. Wildlife navigated these snow-drifted roads with careful grace. Deer traced paths between drifts, leaving delicate tracks, while smaller creatures moved through narrow openings or under overhangs, avoiding exposure. Birds occasionally hopped along fences or bare branches, vigilant and watchful, their soft calls barely piercing the still air. Inside homes, families observed the snow-drifted roads from frost-lined windows, noting travelers who ventured out and marking time by the slow progress of carts or walkers along the distant white paths. Fires continued to glow warmly, meals were shared with deliberation, and children imagined journeys across sparkling landscapes, building stories of resilience and exploration in their minds. Even amidst the challenges of drifted roads, there was a subtle beauty, a glittering, quiet world shaped by snow, patience, and persistence. Each careful step along these paths, whether by human or animal, became a testament to endurance, vigilance, and hope, as the year without a summer continued to test the strength and spirit of all who lived within its frozen embrace. By mid-July, rooftops across villages were still glazed with layers of frost and thin ice, their tiles shimmering in muted sunlight. Even as the days grew warmer, the northern-facing sides held on to icy fingers that clung stubbornly, creating delicate lace-like patterns along eaves and chimneys. The rooftops sparkled like scattered gems, each glint catching the eye with fleeting brilliance before fading into shadow. Villagers ascended ladders cautiously to inspect roofs, checking for weak tiles or accumulations that might crack under the combined weight of frost and snow. The smell of damp wood and melting ice hung in the air, sharp yet grounding, blending with the ever-present scent of burning fires wafting from chimneys. Children watched from below, fascinated by the tiny waterfalls forming as ice slowly dripped and glistened in the sunlight. Animals adapted to the frosted rooftops in subtle ways. Birds perched carefully along ridges, wings tucked close against their bodies, while cats tracked movements along ledges with precise caution. Dogs, curious about drips and splashes, padded slowly near walls, noses twitching at the scent of cold water and frozen wood. Even livestock seemed attuned to the thawing shifts above, raising heads as distant icicles fell with soft taps against the ground. Inside homes, fires burned brightly, countering the chill that lingered despite the lengthening days. Families continued routines shaped by months of persistent frost, preparing meals slowly, layering clothing, and maintaining warmth in every corner. The flickering glow of flames cast dancing shadows on walls and ceilings, offering comfort and a sense of gentle stability. The frosted roof tiles, resilient and delicate, became a symbol of endurance. They held fast through relentless cold, bending but rarely breaking under the weight of ice and snow. In their silent persistence, villagers found inspiration, a quiet reminder that beauty and strength could coexist, even in the harshest conditions. Every glance at those shimmering tiles became a moment to pause, appreciate, and draw warmth from the resilience all around them. By late July, even the carefully tended gardens were subdued under the persistent cold. Frost clung stubbornly to the stems of vegetables and herbs, and any early blossoms were tiny, fragile, and tentative. The once vibrant beds now glistened in muted shades of green, brown, and white, a subdued mosaic that reflected both the harshness of the season and the quiet perseverance of life. Villagers worked patiently in the gardens, moving slowly to avoid damaging delicate plants hardened by frost. Hands, protected by thick gloves, gently cleared patches of ice or loosened frozen soil, coaxing seedlings toward sunlight whenever it broke through clouds. The air smelled of damp earth, melting frost, and faint traces of herbs and flowers, a mixture both comforting and grounding after months of relentless cold. Children often peeked into garden plots from frost-lined windows, imagining secret worlds where tiny sprouts pushed determinedly through ice, bending toward warmth. Adults encouraged these imaginings, sharing stories of past summers and teaching lessons about patience, care, and observation. Every effort in the garden, however small, became a quiet victory, a subtle assertion of life against adversity. Animals also interacted with the frozen gardens carefully. Birds hopped along pathways, pecking at any exposed seeds or insects. Rabbits and small mammals explored the edges cautiously, searching for any nourishment hidden beneath frost. Livestock lingered near barn-adjacent plots, sniffing the air, while cats patrolled the perimeter, ears twitching at the slightest sound. Even amidst frost, the gardens exuded a gentle beauty. Crystalline patterns on leaves shimmered in sunlight, droplets of melted frost glistened like tiny jewels, and the careful rhythms of tending soil and seedlings reinforced the quiet endurance of villagers. In the frozen garden, life persisted patiently, teaching resilience, hope, and the profound satisfaction that comes from nurturing even the smallest signs of growth. By early August, windows across villages were coated with persistent frost, tiny ice crystals forming intricate, filigree patterns along every pane. Sunlight, when it broke through clouds, refracted through these delicate formations, scattering faint rainbows across walls and floors. The frozen windows became both a barrier and a canvas, holding cold at bay while reflecting nature's artistry in subtle, mesmerizing ways. Villagers cleaned windows cautiously, careful not to crack brittle glass, and often traced fingers over frosted patterns, leaving fleeting marks that vanished almost immediately. The smell of smoke, mixed with the faint scent of melting frost and lingering dampness, filled the air, creating a comforting yet vivid sensory presence indoors. Children pressed their noses against icy panes, marveling at shapes that resembled lace, snowflakes, or tiny creatures frozen in motion. Outside, the wind whistled gently across frozen glass, creating faint vibrations that echoed softly through homes. Travelers and animals alike moved with attention. Horses shifted their weight on icy streets. Deer stepped carefully along frost-hardened paths, and small birds occasionally alighted on windowsills, their feet chilled but their vigilance sharp. Inside, families relied on warmth and light more than ever. Fires crackled brightly, casting golden hues onto frost-laden walls and ceilings. Hot drinks steamed in mugs, blankets were wrapped snugly, and soft conversation or storytelling offered gentle companionship against the persistent cold. Even routine tasks, preparing meals, tending animals, or mending clothing, were infused with mindfulness, each movement deliberate, each small success comforting. The icy windows offered subtle lessons in patience and appreciation. They reminded villagers to slow down, to notice beauty in detail, and to cherish the warmth and stability within their homes. In the shimmering patterns they saw both the fragility and endurance of life, a quiet reminder that even in the year without a summer, moments of wonder persisted, reflected in every delicate crystal of frost. By mid-August, the hills surrounding villages remained capped with snow, their contours softened and smoothed into gentle, sparkling waves. Even as temperatures climbed during the day, shaded slopes clung to frost, creating contrasts of white and muted green where thawed patches revealed stubborn grass beneath. The hills seemed to glow in the weak sunlight, their snow caps a reminder that winter's memory still lingered in the world. Villagers traveling along hillside paths moved carefully, navigating slippery inclines and hidden icy patches. Each footstep left a fleeting mark in the snow, soon erased by drifting flakes or the delicate trickle of melting frost. The air carried a crisp, clean scent tinged with damp earth and faint pine, a mixture that invigorated the senses even while demanding attentiveness. Animals adapted to the snow-capped hills with quiet grace. Deer leapt carefully between exposed patches, hooves sinking lightly into soft snow, while rabbits and smaller creatures darted among rocks and low shrubs to avoid exposure. Birds glided along the slopes, wings angled to catch gentle updrafts, their calls sharp and distant over the still, glimmering landscape. Inside homes, the snow-capped hills were observed with quiet admiration. Children pressed faces to frost-lined windows, imagining enchanted lands atop sparkling peaks, while adults reflected on the persistence of cold and the slow promise of thaw. Fires burned steadily, meals were shared slowly, and every moment of warmth and comfort was treasured against the backdrop of lingering snow. The snow-capped hills became symbols of endurance and beauty. They held frost with elegance, shaped the landscape with quiet power, and reminded villagers that resilience could coexist with hardship. Observing their shimmering peaks, families felt a mixture of reverence, patience, and gentle hope, a calming acknowledgment that even in a year without a summer, life persisted, steady and enduring. By late August, the wells that supplied villages with water still bore traces of ice along their edges. Though the sun's rays had grown stronger, shadows cast by well walls and surrounding buildings preserved thin layers of frost, creating glistening rims around the openings. Drawing water required care, the rope and bucket slipping easily on icy surfaces, and each drop was valued for both its warmth and its sustenance. Villagers approached the frozen wells slowly, hands wrapped in layered cloth or leather gloves. They tested the stability of each rope and tread carefully on frost-slick stones surrounding the wells. The scent of damp earth mixed with the faint tang of mineral-rich water, mingling with smoke from nearby chimneys to form a grounding, familiar aroma. Animals also interacted cautiously with these wells. Dogs sniffed near edges, ears alert, while livestock waited patiently at nearby troughs, shifting weight and stamping feet to maintain warmth. Birds perched on edges, pecking sparingly at crumbs or small insects, their delicate movements careful against the icy surfaces. Inside homes, water from the wells was a precious resource. It was warmed for cooking, cleaning, and washing, each use measured and deliberate. Fires glowed warmly against frost-darkened walls. Meals were shared slowly, and the quiet rhythm of domestic life contrasted gently with the vigilance required outdoors. Children listened intently to stories while glancing occasionally at frost-kissed windows, their imagination filling in the harsh, beautiful world beyond. The frozen wells became symbols of patience and necessity. Life continued with care and attention, each step and each drop reflecting resilience in a harsh season. Villagers learned to respect the subtle dangers of lingering frost while appreciating the quiet rewards it offered. Shimmering beauty, delicate patterns, and the ongoing reminder that even in the year without a summer, survival required mindfulness, care, and steady hope. By early September, some fields began to reveal glimmers of thawed soil amidst lingering patches of frost and snow. Each opening of dark earth against the remaining white shimmered in the pale sunlight, creating a subtle, magical contrast across the landscape. The fields, though far from fully recovered, suggested the slow return of life, with small shoots of green daring to emerge where ice had once ruled. Villagers moved carefully through these glimmering fields, treading softly to avoid crushing tender shoots. Tools scraped gently at the partially frozen ground, coaxing the earth into readiness for whatever planting or maintenance could be attempted. The smell of thawing soil mingled with smoke from nearby chimneys and the faint tang of frost created a rich sensory experience, both earthy and invigorating. Animals responded to these first signs of thaw with cautious optimism. Birds hopped lightly along softened patches, pecking for seeds or insects now more accessible. Deer grazed on emerging grass, hooves pressing delicately into softened earth, while smaller creatures explored openings in snow and frost, searching for hidden nourishment. Even livestock showed signs of renewed energy, moving with lighter steps toward partially thawed pastures. Inside homes, the glimmering fields inspired quiet celebration. Families continued their routines, but conversation often turned to the subtle signs of life returning outdoors. Meals were shared with a sense of gratitude. Fires glowed warmly, and children pressed against frost-lined windows to watch the delicate emergence of color across once white fields. The glimmering fields became a testament to endurance and hope. They illustrated the slow but inevitable persistence of life, reminding villagers that even after months of relentless cold, the earth and its creatures could endure and recover. Each sparkle of thawing soil, each cautious sprout, offered a gentle, reassuring promise that warmth and growth would eventually return. By mid-September, the hills surrounding villages were often shrouded in soft, lingering mist. Morning sunlight struggled to penetrate the gray veil, casting diffuse, silvery light over frost-speckled slopes and thawing patches of grass. The mist swirled slowly in the gentle breeze, curling around trees and rocks, softening every edge and creating a landscape that felt both mysterious and serene. Villagers moving along hillside paths took measured steps, aware that moisture on the ground made footing treacherous. Each sound, the distant drip of thawing frost, the soft crunch of footsteps, the whisper of wind, was amplified in the quiet, misty air. The scent was a delicate mix of damp earth, melting frost, and pine, a grounding aroma that drew attention to every inhalation and encouraged mindfulness with each movement. Wildlife adapted quietly to the mist. Deer emerged carefully, their hooves sinking softly into softened earth, while birds flitted from branch to branch, their wings brushing moisture-laden leaves. Rabbits and small mammals moved stealthily through underbrush, taking advantage of the veil for protection, while livestock grazed cautiously in sheltered areas, alert to subtle shifts in wind and fog. Inside homes, the misty hills created a gentle ambiance. Fires burned steadily, casting warm light through frost-lined windows. Meals were prepared with care, blankets were arranged snugly, and families spoke in soft tones, matching the subdued atmosphere outside. Children watched the swirling gray landscape, imagining magical lands hidden within the mist, while adults reflected quietly on the perseverance and resilience of life during the long, harsh year. The misty hills, though veiling much of the world, revealed subtle beauty and calm. They reminded villagers of the patience required to navigate a season of challenge and of the quiet wonder in observing the slow return of warmth and life. In the soft gray of dawn and the shimmer of mist over frost and thaw, hope persisted gently, like a whisper carried across the hills. By late September, a gentle thaw had begun to spread slowly across the land. Ice receded from streams, frost clung only to shaded corners, and patches of earth and grass became visible beneath snow that had stubbornly lingered for months. The thaw moved like a soft whisper, gradual and patient, reshaping the landscape without urgency, and inviting life to re-emerge carefully. Villagers observed the subtle changes with cautious hope. They walked more confidently across once slippery paths, tending fields and gardens with gentle precision. Hands brushed away lingering frost from plants, and every small patch of dark, thawed soil was treated with care, ready for seeds, sprouts, or tender shoots daring to emerge. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, melting ice, and smoke from hearths, mingling into an aroma both comforting and evocative of life's slow return. Animals responded eagerly to the thaw. Birds hopped along partially melted banks, chirping softly as insects and seeds became accessible. Deer grazed on the first tender grass shoots, moving lightly over softened earth. Small mammals emerged cautiously, exploring the terrain with delicate steps, while livestock wandered further into pastures, delighting in newly available forage. Inside homes, the gentle thaw brought warmth and reassurance. Fires glowed steadily, but the sun streaming through clearer windows added a new, subtle comfort. Families prepared meals with renewed ease, blankets were lighter in the day, and children pressed their faces to panes, marveling at the earth gradually emerging from frost and snow. Conversations reflected hope and cautious optimism. Stories of winter endured, mingling with dreams of future summers. The gentle thaw symbolized patience, resilience, and the quiet triumph of life over adversity. It reminded villagers that even after a prolonged year without a summer, the world could slowly reclaim its warmth and vitality. Each softened patch, each trickle of water, each emerging green shoot offered a tender, soothing assurance that life persisted steadily and gently, ready to flourish when the time was right. By early October, the landscape had begun to breathe again. Snow and frost had retreated to shaded hollows, leaving hills, fields, and forests adorned with damp, earthy colors and the faint sparkle of lingering dew. Streams flowed freely, carrying the soft music of water over stones once frozen, and the sun's gentle warmth penetrated the morning air, coaxing life from the soil. Villagers moved through this transforming world with renewed energy and quiet reverence. Fields were inspected, seeds carefully planted in thawed soil, and gardens tended with the knowledge that each fragile sprout represented the culmination of months of patience and endurance. The air was rich with scents of damp earth, moss, thawing frost, and the subtle aroma of wood smoke, a comforting, grounding mixture that spoke of both struggle endured and hope restored. Animals flourished alongside humans in this slowly renewing world. Birds sang more freely, deer grazed confidently on the first tender grass, and small mammals ventured boldly from their winter refuges. Livestock wandered further across pastures, their movements lighter, energized by newly accessible forage. Even insects began to stir, tiny reminders of the gradual return of abundance and warmth. Inside homes, families embraced the season's changes with quiet celebration. Fires continued to glow gently, complementing the sunlight streaming through clear windows. Meals were shared with renewed gratitude, blankets were tucked neatly for cooler nights, and children marveled at the gradual emergence of green in the fields and hills, their imaginations alight with the promise of a summer that, though delayed, was slowly reclaiming the world. The return of life across the villages and countryside became a living testament to endurance, resilience, and hope. After months of relentless cold, frost, and scarcity, the world demonstrated its remarkable capacity to recover. Villagers, observing every tender sprout, listening to the song of returning birds, and feeling warmth creeping into homes and hearts alike, learned a profound truth. Even in the harshest of seasons, life persists, gently, patiently, and beautifully. And now, as the frozen year finally fades, let the memory of resilience and renewal carry you gently into rest. Good night.